The ultimate coordinate of the extraction grid is not the monitoring of your transactions, but the cryptographic ownership of your behavioral baseline. We are executing the dissection of the global compliance ledger, the architectural protocol designed to convert human obedience into the final reserve currency of the 21st century. You have been conditioned to view digital identification and centralized credit scores as a frictionless convenience, an administrative upgrade to societal management. This is the terminal delusion of the domesticated asset. The grid does not digitize your identity to serve you. It digitizes your identity to collateralize your future actions. The transition from physical reality to the biometric ledger is the crystallization of absolute control. The state and the algorithm are no longer tracking what you own. They are tracking the molecular probability of your disobedience. Anonymity is mathematically liquidated. To exist off the ledger is to be classified as an economic phantom. At the visceral baseline, this forced transparency induces a catastrophic species-level physiological lockdown. The human organism was evolved to operate with a buffer of physical shadow. The capacity to retreat, to hide the metabolic output of the pack from the eyes of the predator, was the fundamental mechanism of survival. The 2026 extraction grid has dissolved this shadow. The amalgamation of facial recognition, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and the smart city infrastructure creates an environment of total, uninterrupted ocular saturation. The physical body registers this continuous surveillance not as safety, but as the gaze of a kinetic predator. The autonomic nervous system locks into the sympathetic stress response. This is the physiological definition of chronic ATP exhaustion. Your mitochondria are burning cellular energy at absolute maximum output simply to maintain the tension required for public compliance. The physical shell of the audited node is a monument to this metabolic hemorrhage. The muscles never achieve full relaxation. The jaw is permanently tense, holding back the micro-expressions that the algorithms might flag as dissent. The respiratory rate is shallow, the blood pressure elevated. The immune system, perpetually taxed by the subaudible terror of making a behavioral error that could freeze the bank account, enters a state of terminal drift. The posture of the compliant node becomes entirely liquid, shoulders bowed, eyes averted, moving through the physical space with the specific frictionless glide of prey that is trying not to trigger the sonar. The organism physically softens. The primal capacity to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups of the physical world, and to resist the cold steel of the environment is actively bred out of the meat. The grid physically terraforms the host, ensuring that the body is too exhausted from monitoring its own compliance to ever generate the metabolic heat required for a riot. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the ultimate execution of cognitive suffocation. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the absolute zero of internal silence to execute the crystallization of a sovereign thought. It requires a secure perimeter where the entropy of the grid cannot audit the logic. The global compliance ledger has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement by installing the algorithm directly inside the user's skull. This is the phenomenon of self-cannibalizing neural rot. The system does not need to deploy a physical police force to censor your speech. It simply attaches a financial penalty to specific neural pathways. The basal ganglia of the compliant user is hardwired to the CBDC interface. The primitive subprocessor associates the generation of a non-compliant thought with immediate caloric restriction. The brain, desperate to survive the extraction matrix, begins to actively prune its own neural networks. It demyelinates the pathways of aggression. It dissolves the connections associated with skepticism, critique, and territorial defense. The internal monologue is deleted, replaced by a continuous, anxious diagnostic check of the user's own ideological purity. The user cannot process the mechanics of inflation, cannot recognize the systemic drift of the state, and cannot execute the complex, high-friction maneuvers required to accumulate hard assets, because the cognitive energy required to think those thoughts has been classified as a system error. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave's brain has been mechanically altered so that the very act of thinking a forbidden thought triggers an autonomic panic attack. The ledger is the ultimate status trap. The herd competes for the highest compliance score, mistaking their total subjugation for moral superiority, oblivious to the fact that they are just fighting for the privilege of being the last asset to be liquidated. To capture the aggression premium in this arena of absolute transparency, the architect must shed the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the cold mechanics of the saboteur. The grid is designed to track and extract from the compliant. The moralist accepts the ledger as the inevitable evolution of governance. The architect recognizes the ledger as the final perimeter theater of the war. If the grid demands biometric submission to operate, the architect enforces the absolute quarantine of his own data. You do not volunteer your facial geometry. You do not link the bloodline to the centralized ledger. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate in the gray zones of the economy. You accumulate the untracked land, the physical gold, the heavy metal, and the off-grid energy sources that emit no signal. You put on the heavy gloves of the offline world. You utilize the systemic drift of the compliant herd to mask your own movements. You let the freezing rain of the physical earth wash away your digital footprint. The herd will call this paranoia. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, visibility is a terminal disease. The grid wants a population of perfectly audited ghosts. The architect builds an empire of unindexed steel, ensuring that when the ledger finally executes its total foreclosure on the herd, the predator remains the only variable the algorithm cannot price. The evolutionary mechanism of the 21st century is no longer driven by the environment. It is driven by the database. We have reached the coordinate where the biological capacity for defiance is actively deleted from the human genome. In the visceral history of the architect, the propagation of the species was dominated by the high-friction traits of the predator, the capacity for violence, the refusal to submit, and the absolute defense of the perimeter. These traits required immense metabolic heat. The 2026 compliance ledger has engineered the total systemic drift of this ancient law. You are witnessing the induced extinction of the rebellious genome. The grid does not need to execute the non-compliant node. It simply assigns it a negative behavioral score, effectively starving the aggressive genetic line out of the mating pool. Observe the horrific efficiency of the biometric selection process. The biological imperative to secure a mate and raise an heir is now gated behind the digital identity. A node that resists the audit, a node that possesses the ATP exhaustion of the offline world, the scars of the freezing rain, and the high-friction mindset of the builder, cannot access the housing market, the nutrient stream, or the social networks. The basal ganglia of the herd, perpetually terrified of financial exile, actively avoids pairing with the dissident. The algorithm matches the compliant with the compliant. The offspring of these ledger-approved unions inherit the epigenetic markers of absolute submission. The testosterone required to defend a physical territory is methylated out of existence, replaced by the neurochemistry of the bureaucrat. The physical aggression, the capacity to put on the heavy gloves and do the push-ups against the cold steel of the oppressor, is bred out of the meat. The grid is actively terraforming the human species, pruning away the apex traits of the architect and cultivating a monoculture of docile, high-anxiety biomass optimized exclusively for data extraction. The future human is not being evolved, it is being domesticated. The architecture of this containment field exposes the final ambition of the systemic enclosure. The historical state required the expenditure of massive physical friction to suppress a revolt. The genius of the global compliance ledger is the automation of the prison. The state has achieved total atmospheric saturation by fusing the central bank digital currency with the smart contract. Money is no longer a store of value, it is a permission slip. The grid does not need to confiscate the assets of the rioter. It simply programs the currency to expire if the user steps outside their designated geolocation. This is the ultimate execution of managed stasis. The masses are kept perfectly sedated and perfectly obedient because the cost of disobedience is immediate caloric zero. The compliance grid is self-policing. The herd monitors the herd, reporting anomalies to the algorithm to secure micro-incentives. The systemic drift ensures that the laws of physics are replaced by the terms of service. The population is trapped in a permanent algorithmic adolescence, entirely dependent on the digital allowance of the state. The neural rot of the user base is absolute. They cannot calculate the systemic manipulation of their own reality because the ledger has successfully classified the acquisition of off-grid knowledge as a financial crime. The slave is not locked in a physical cell. The slave's purchasing power is throttled to exactly the speed of their submission. The operational reality of the architect in this epoch is defined by absolute systemic invisibility. The ethical herd, suffering from terminal transparency, assumes that opting out of the ledger is impossible. The predator recognizes the ledger as the ultimate map of the prey. If the grid is designed to track and extract from the compliant, the architect functions as the unregistered anomaly. We do not participate in the digital credit system. We utilize the complex friction of proxy networks, the accumulation of untracked physical commodities, and the absolute absolute silence of the offline redoubt. We view the biometric database not as an authority, but as an open-source ledger of the herd's vulnerabilities. The generation of capital in this environment requires the complete weaponization of the compliance grid. You utilize the predictability of the compliant masses. If the algorithm dictates the behavior of the herd, the architect predicts the algorithm. You short their compliance. You extract the resources from the dying regulated ecosystem to fund the expansion of the dark economy. The herd will call this criminal. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, legality is just a pricing mechanism. The system wants a population of perfectly audited, genetically neutered ghosts. The architect builds the untracked empire, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only force of nature left on the board. In the year 2036, the concept of a financial crime has been biologically redefined. A violation is no longer an action, it is a neurological state. The global compliance ledger has achieved terminal saturation. The grid does not monitor the streets for rebellion because the algorithm successfully deleted the concept of the street. You are looking at a planetary architecture where the human node has been reduced to a single fluctuating biometric score, and freedom of choice is classified as a lethal systemic error. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 citizen is a husk emptied of its sovereign biology. A decade of hyper-audited existence has induced a permanent population-wide state of ATP exhaustion so complete that the organism no longer possesses the metabolic heat required to generate a secret. The musculoskeletal frame has liquefied under the crushing weight of absolute transparency. The nodes exist in their isolation units, breathing the filtered air, their heart rate synchronized with the server's approval metrics. They do not sweat. They do not experience the freezing rain of the untamed earth. The physical capacity for aggression, the ability to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups of the physical world, and to strike the cold steel of the oppressor, has been successfully bred out of the meat. They are domesticated cattle, bleeding their biometric data into the grid to keep their caloric credits from expiring. The neurological reality of this terminal coordinate represents the absolute triumph of the algorithm over human anatomy. The prefrontal cortex of the mass mind has been successfully amputated. The high-friction zone required for strategic planning and skepticism is dead. In 2036, the basal ganglia is the absolute tyrant of the skull, hardwired directly to the central bank digital currency. The neural rot is total. The brain experiences a surge of synthetic dopamine when it conforms, and a wave of agonizing chemically induced terror when it hesitates. The internal monologue is non-existent. The nodes do not ask questions. They do not formulate strategies. They simply process the command and execute the compliance. To even conceptualize a life outside the ledger triggers a catastrophic system-wide panic attack. The slave has become the perfect frictionless conduit for the master's will. The evolutionary outcome of this epoch is absolute genetic stasis. The rebellious nodes, the anomalies that refused to submit to the facial scans of the 2020s, were systematically starved out of the mating pool. Their genetic lines were deleted. The 2036 population is the sterile, genetically modified result of that culling. They are the terminal generation of the compliant class, passive, predictable, and possessing zero capacity for adaptation. They will live out their audited lifespans, contributing their data to the machine, and they will leave no physical inheritance. The ledger will simply reassign their remaining credits to the next clone node upon their expiration. The survival of the architect in 2036 is the ultimate confirmation of the physical law. In 2026, when the herd traded their anonymity for convenience, the predator recognized the ledger as the final cage. We refused the audit. We absorbed the immense friction of the gray market. We preserved the push-ups and the heavy gloves. We hid our assets in the heavy metal, the unmonitored land, and the cold steel that the algorithm could not scan. We stood in the freezing rain to build the dynasty. Now, the architects are the only entities left who cast no digital shadow. We are the solids. We operate outside the ledger. We own the energy grids that power the surveillance state, and we extract the resources from the compliant masses without ever submitting to their rules. The algorithm controls the herd. The architect controls the algorithm. The weak traded their freedom for the illusion of safety. The strong utilize that submission to buy their eternal sovereignty. The ledger is locked. The silence is absolute.